Hi again, everybody. Today we're going to talk about operant conditioning. Uh, Anytime you're trying to train somebody or something, a specific behavior, operant conditioning is one of the uh, tools at your disposal. And we'll talk about the basics of the theory and give a few examples to kind of walk it through. Let's start with some history. This is how it goes when you're dealing with a big psychological construct that's been around for a long time. But then we'll get into the how-tos and what the different pieces all mean. So operant conditioning tied most directly to Skinner, B.F. Skinner's work, which was dominant from the 1930s through the 1980s. Skinner was one of the most impactful psychologists of all time. But there are some misrepresentations of his work, and I'll try to clarify some of those misrepresentations. So anyway, first off, operant conditioning. In 1935, Skinner outlined a change in the field by saying there are actually two kinds of learning, or two paradigms for learning that exist. The first one is classical conditioning. That exists from prior work with Watson and Pavlov, which he referred to as type 2 conditioning. And he said it's actually different than what he refers to as type 1 conditioning, which we now call operant conditioning. And this is a snapshot from the article that he wrote in 1935. And I want to just put this up here because the history of psychology is always interesting. But I wanted to let illustrate kind of the big difference that occurs here. In the top graphic with type 1 conditioning, he represented that there's a S sub 0, which is listed as lever in the graphic, and then R sub 0, which is pressing, S sub 1, which is food, and then R sub 1, which he referred to as, in this case, salivation. But really what matters in this particular situation, and what he argues in this article, are the first three things there. S sub 0 is a stimulus, R sub 0 is a response, and more importantly, S sub 1 is a stimulus. And basically when you think about this, if you're a real involved applied behavior analyst, you'll know these terms as discriminate stimulus, that's the S sub 0. R sub 0 is just the response, and then the S sub 1 is the food. And at the end, the R1 in this graphic he referred to as irrelevant. And basically, it basically is irrelevant for the purposes of operant conditioning. In fact, the most important part of operant conditioning is really the R0, S1. That's the association that gets made, because the behavior leads to something. And that's where it's what we refer to as consequences. So in this graphic, S sub 1 is some form of consequence. The S sub 0 just presents information to the operant, the learner, the animal, about options for what can exist in the situation. Now that type 2 classical conditioning down below, I just put that on there because I always think it's interesting. This is actually what led to one of the biggest misconceptions in psychological history, in my opinion. This particular graphic, which has been replicated in lots of textbooks over the years, and it actually confused a lot of folks because if you've watched the classical conditioning example, the pairing that actually matters in a classical conditioning is the S sub 0, the light, and the S sub 1, the food or the shock or whatever it may be. That's the pairing that matters. And you see there's no actual line between those two things. And when Skinner explains it, he explains it properly, but this graphic doesn't really help well because he was really focused on SR explanations, trying to make connections between stimuli. And as you can see, even he has R sub 0 in this one is not important. That's his labeling, not mine. So anyway, just put that there for, as I said, a little bit of history. Now, back to that, and again, just to illustrate what we're talking about, the difference, the key part, the S1 in this, the stimulus that follows a behavior, is called a consequence. And there are 4 primary consequences in operant conditioning. And when you're looking at test questions on this, for instance, the thing that you need to pay attention to is, was a stimulus presented as the consequence or removed? And did the behavior increase or decrease due to that? So the consequence leads to a predictable or reliable behavioral increase or decrease, depending on what kind of consequence it is. By the way, it's not what the consequence is meant to do, it's what the consequence actually does that matters. So I can intend for the consequence that I give you to mean to lead to a behavioral increase, but if it doesn't actually lead to a behavioral increase, then it's not a reinforcement. So anyway, this table is a nice little breakdown to explain the different situations. So if I have a behavioral increase after the presentation of a stimulus, that's a positive reinforcement. So I give you a sticker because you turn in your homework, and you turn in your homework again in the future, sticker was a positive reinforcement. If my behavior increases after I remove a stimulus, that's called a negative reinforcement, which is the most confusing term for most people in this class. People make all kinds of mistakes with this. They think, oh, negative reinforcement is a bad thing. No, negative reinforcement means I removed a stimulus and I reinforce the behavior. So the example that is often given here is I take away your chores because you did a nice thing, a good behavior. And in the future, you do that behavior more often because you were rewarded by me relieving you of those chores. You escaped chores is the best way to talk about it. If you talk about escape or avoidance of a negative situation, then that could, and it leads to a behavioral increase, that's a negative reinforcement. If I'm decreasing your behavior, now we're talking about punishments. So if something happens after a behavior and that something leads to the behavior to go down, then it's been some form of punishment. If the thing that makes it go down is the presentation of something, like I shock you or I squirt water in your face or something like that, that's a positive punishment or a presentation punishment. If, on the other hand, the thing that leads to your behavioral decrease is something that's been taken away from you, then that's called a removal punishment or a negative punishment, or what some folks will actually call a response cost. So that's a very common situation where I ground you, take away phone privileges, remove things that you desire, and in order to get you to stop doing a behavior that I don't like. So we'll just go through these all real briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to pause them if you want to break these out and look at them more carefully. But the most common one that we would like to talk about is a positive reinforcement. Your behavior is increased due to the presentation of a stimulus that follows the behavior. And these are called rewards. Common things include praise, increase in pay, or I give you a desired activity. It doesn't have to be monetary. It doesn't have to be tangible. It can be anything that the individual likes. So just an attaboy, attagirl, that can be a positive reinforcement if it leads to a behavioral increase. Negative reinforcement, as I said, is something with escape or avoidance. I'm getting away from an annoying alarm clock by turning it off or pressing snooze. I put the dishes away because it stops the nagging of my roommate, or I want to get out of a restricted location, right? Like I'm in a timeout situation, so I know I have to do the right thing in order to get that better. And another example is a crying baby. How do I get a crying baby to stop crying? I pick it up. And when I pick it up, the crying baby stops crying. The crying baby is negatively reinforcing the parents by removing the crying sound. Positive punishment, presentation punishment, these are all things that I'm not going to recommend any of them, but these are actual presentation or positive punishments. Spanking is meant to, and if it does lead to a reduced amount of behavior, then that would be a presentation punishment. Electric shock is also something that will lead to a reduction in behavior many times. Not always. If it doesn't work, it's no longer a punishment. Aversion therapy, such as antabuse, which is you put a drug in a product and it makes the person violently sick. Then they won't want that product anymore. If I drink a beer and now I'm throwing up after just tasting the beer, in the future I'll probably stop drinking the beer. And then finally, extra homework is something that teachers often do to correct bad behavior. This is a bad idea because basically what you're communicating is homework's bad. Homework's a negative thing. Bad kids get homework. That's not the message you really want to send. And finally, removal punishment, as I mentioned, is called response cost. Timeout is actually a removal punishment because I remove you from the rewarding situation, the fun activities, etc. I'm putting you in the corner. So you miss out on all the positive activities. Now, timeout will only work if the place I'm removing you from is more exciting or rewarding than the place I put you. My teachers used to put me in the hallway a lot when I was in elementary school. And it didn't work because the hallway was more entertaining than the classroom that I was in that was leading my negative behavior. If I take away recess, that is, you lose recess, then that's a removal punishment. Losing phone privileges, getting grounded, having some sort of fine is also a negative punishment. Or losing tokens can be a negative punishment. Now, when I use these consequences, particularly when we're talking about reinforcement, and ideally positive reinforcement is the best way to think about this. There are what we refer to as schedules. A continuous reinforcement schedule means every time you display the behavior, you get a reward. Every single time. So if you turn something in, I give you a token. Every time. That's called continuous reinforcement. It's exhausting, but it's a good way to get people started toward a habit. More common are what we refer to as intermittent reinforcement, which is reinforcement that comes at a less consistent level. But the idea is you lead to better long-term learning, and it's also more efficient for the person who's doing the rewarding. Fixed versus variable is the way we refer to these most of the time. And so the fixed reinforcement schedule means that on a certain number of occurrences, or after a certain period of time that is fixed and doesn't change, you get the reward. Versus variable, where it can vary from time to time. The best is to have variable. And the overall best is the variable interval. You can see here, interval, time, ratio, and duration. These are different ways that we keep track of the iterations of the reinforcements over time. So a variable interval scale or variable interval reinforcement schedule is a situation where it's not known every time when I'm going to get the reward because it's variable, but after a certain number of instances of showing the behavior, then I will get the reward. So every 5 times on average, I'll get a token or a reward or an attaboy or a high five when I do the behavior that the person is trying to promote. If you're trying to teach a dog to sit, for instance, I'm going to start off and I'm going to say sit. And when it sits, I give it a treat. And then I'm going to say sit again. And it sits again, I give it a treat. Sit again, just over and over and over again. Treat, 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 treat. Then I'm going to start to back that off and say sit. The dog sits. And then I release, and then we sit, and then maybe I give them a treat. Or I give them a different kind of reinforcement, not always the treat. So I say sit. The dog sits. I say yes. And then maybe a treat. And then over time, I just say yes, and then the dog will get a little bit of reinforcement for doing the right behavior. And then you can spread that out over time. And eventually, you don't have to reward them every single time they do the behavior is the point. Now, a lot of times we train something, and then they stop doing it, or they get less effective at it. And this is referred to as extinction. And what that means is a previously reinforced behavior no longer leads to the reinforcer, and so therefore the behavior stops. That is, I say sit, and the dog doesn't sit because I never give it treats anymore, right? So basically, I've taken away your reinforcer over time, and the behavior goes back to just being, whatever I want to do. So when that happens, we refer to it as extinction, and sometimes it's a bad thing because you stop doing the behavior that I want. Sometimes we want to cause extinction, and which the examples down below is like if I have a child who has a lot of tantrums. Tantrums are usually caused by an interest in attention, and if every time the child has a tantrum and starts crying, I go over and pick them up or soothe them or whatever, then they'll use tantrums whenever they want that attention. When you want to train away that behavior, one thing you can use is an extinction situation where you stop giving the attention or you ignore the behavior. When that happens, the child will usually try something else. By the way, what normally happens when you're trying to get it to extinguish a negative or inappropriate behavior, they will try lots of other things similar to the original behavior, and sometimes raise the ante, if you will, and make things even more problematic for you. That's referred to as the extinction burst. So when I remove the reinforcer, the animal or the child or the adult will try the behavior that has normally been successful in the past. And they've always gotten it before, but now all of a sudden it's not happening. So they start trying little iterations. This is actually how shaping occurs. So if I'm trying to train a dog to lie down, and I say sit and then down, and when I'm doing that, I'm also probably giving them a visual signal, going closer to the ground with a treat in my hand, for instance. Maybe they're confused and they try all kinds of stuff and they spin around and do all kinds of weird things. And if they do something, I'm like, well, that's kind of cool. Actually, I want to have them do that. Then I'll reward them right when they do that behavior. And when they do that, they'll repeat that weird behavior. They don't know why, but they got a treat. So that will happen many times. Unfortunately, sometimes what will happen is what we refer to as superstition. They think something that they did was the rewarded behavior, even though it wasn't what I'm intended to reward. And so they'll keep repeating that rewarded behavior. And then you get what's called a superstitious behavior. And this is where actually superstitions arise in human beings many times, historically speaking. For instance, if I put on my socks a certain way before a game and I win, and I somehow think that putting on my socks that way mattered, then I will continue to put on my socks that way. Or you get pitchers who jump over the line, walk into the baseball field, things like that. Those superstitions become more and more ridiculous sometimes, but they do have a root in this basic behavior where a positive outcome occurred due to something they believe was connected. Obviously, how I wear my socks doesn't necessarily lead to a result. It can if I'm no longer distracted by my socks, things like that. Now, you've probably heard about spontaneous recovery, which is where something will flare back up. So I train somebody to do something, and then they stop doing it, and then after a while they suddenly start doing it again, even though I haven't been reinforcing them. This is a situation where basically they're trying to get the reinforcer again, and the extinction is overwhelmed. If you reward them for the behavior quickly, then they will actually quote unquote recover it. It wasn't necessarily that they spontaneously recovered the behavior, by the way. It's just they recognize now that, oh yeah, that behavior is being rewarded again. That is being reinforced again. It's just a probability in the moment that happens. Okay, a couple of quick notes. Extinction does not equal ignoral. A lot of the examples I give have to do with ignoring a negative behavior, and then that behavior will fade, and then we call it extinction. Ignoral is a way that we can have extinction occur, but that's not the only way that it will happen. Excuse me. It's easier to extinguish continuously reinforced behaviors. If the expectation that they get the reward every single time, once I stop giving the reward, it's more obvious that something has changed. Whereas if I have an intermittent reinforcement schedule and I don't get a reward right now, well, that's okay, because I don't get it every time. I get it some of the times or frequently. So that's one of the good reasons to have intermittent reinforcement schedules, because it allows them to stretch out and repeat the behavior more and more often, even though they didn't get a reward every single time. For those of you who want to go deeper with this, I'm not going to spend time on it, but we do in this field talk about differential reinforcement. And what that means is if I have an undesirable behavior, I want to reinforce something else. So instead of just telling your dog no, what you want to do is train your dog an alternative behavior. So if I don't like my dog jumping up on people, I can reinforce a different thing. When new people come to the house, instead of saying, no, stop it, no, June, get down, all that kind of stuff, instead of being, telling them what not to do, when a new person comes to the home, you train the dog, sit. Whenever they see a new person, if they sit, then you reward that desired behavior over and over again with new people. It's called a differential reinforcement. What I'm doing is I'm crowding out the inappropriate behavior by giving them an alternative behavior that can be more consistently rewarded, and it shows the dog what they actually want. By the way, all the things that I talk about when I talk about a dog apply to kids too. It's just people get a little upset when you talk about training children. So I'm training the dogs here. That is, instead of telling someone what not to do, you tell them what to do, and then you reward it. It's a much more positive way to get to it. With differential reinforcement, there are lots of different ways that people will talk about it. And this table explains all the different ways. You have differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors, and differential reinforcement of other, or the DRA, DRI, and DRO explanations of that. And that's that explanation of what I'm trying to do is replace a negative behavior with a new preferred behavior. What's the difference? Differential reinforcement of alternative, it means any alternative behavior can be reinforced. The DRI means that I'm training them to an alternative behavior that's incompatible with the negative behavior. That's what the example I gave before, where the dog jumps up. If I want them not to jump up, I teach them to sit. You can't jump and sit at the same time, that kind of situation. And differential reinforcement of other means the reinforcement is given in the absence of an inappropriate behavior. So as long as they're doing anything else, but not the behavior, they can get the reward. So in the end, the thing that I like to focus on whenever we talk about learning is what is learned and how is it learned. So with operant conditioning, the important thing to know is what is learned. It's an association, just like classical conditioning, but the association in this case is the association between a behavior, or what the animal's response is, and the consequence. And that association leads to the probability that the behavior will be repeated. So if the behavior, saying a bad word, leads to a positive reinforcer, a reward, like my friends laugh and think I'm funny, then I'm going to say it again. However, if that same bad word is said and it leads to a punishment from a parent, either a removal punishment where I take away, your toy, or I present you with some sort of adverse, punishment, like shock the child, which of course we don't do, then that would be a positive or presentation punishment. That's going to lead to a decrease in the behavior. So what is learned? That association between the behavior and the consequence. Now you'll see that most kids will learn in different settings, different behaviors lead to different consequences. That's where that first S sub 0 comes into play, which we also refer to as an antecedent. So when I'm hanging out with my friends, that's context A, using that dirty word leads to a reward. Whereas when I'm hanging out with my parents and I use that dirty word, leads to a punishment. So they learn context matters. Finally, how is it learned? How things are learned with operant conditioning is that when the behavior occurs, there is a reliable presentation of either a reinforcer or a punisher, and that they make that association between my behavior and what comes after. All right, that's the end of our very quick presentation of operant conditioning. Again, it's a very useful strategy for applying a consequence after a behavior in order to manipulate or remediate or to control the behavior of the other individual. Now, one thing I'll say, Skinner was very much against the notion that humans have choice. It's not really true in my representation of operant conditioning. That is, the individual in the situation does have a choice. They have the choice to do the behavior that will lead to a reinforcer that they know is present, or they have a choice to do the behavior that can lead to a punishment as well. There are some contexts where there's no good choice. I recognize that. But I think it's easier to think about training or supporting or modifying behaviors when you recognize that in all cases, there is a choice to be had. And when you're dealing with an animal, it's hard to explain things to an animal. When you're dealing with a child, you can speed up the training in a behavioral operant conditioning situation by explaining to them where those connections occurred. So the response led to a consequence. You explain to them, well, you did this, you chose to do this, this happened. You make that connection clear for them. We know that works because we can actually induce learning that is exactly like this, even if they don't actually receive the consequences. It's a a cognitive behavioral training situation. So they can make this similar learning gains by me just explaining to them what consequences can follow. And as we talk about with social cognitive theory, they can learn the consequences that someone else has experienced vicariously and make those connections as well. So Skinner was a little too what we call radical behaviorist. He was a little too focused on you have to experience the consequence in order for the learning to occur. It's not necessarily true, and you can learn it through these connections, these relationships that you form between a behavior and a consequence, even if you're not the one who experienced it. So I happen to know that if I ride a skateboard and jump up on my skateboard on a rail that goes down a line of stairs, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to get messed up because I've seen lots of videos where that happens. So I've never tried it because I'm just prudent that way, and also I can't ride a skateboard. But I can see other people do ridiculous things and end up with very negative outcomes and learn to moderate my behavior in advance. So just keep that in mind. It's the connection between the behavior and the consequence that follows the behavior, even if I didn't actually experience it myself. And we'll get into that more with social cognitive theory. Have a good day.